Hello everyone, and thanks for attending this talk. It's very exciting to be speaking at the New Zealand GDC. There's a lot of cool people to meet and catch up with, a lot of cool talks happening. I'm very excited to be here. Today I'll be talking about from finance to games, what can game creators learn from the world of investment banking. At the beginning, I'd like to introduce myself first. My name is Feras Musmar. I'm a lead game designer and economy designer on Monster Claw Chronicles, an RPG monster collection game that is coming out soonish on iOS and Android. It's currently being developed by Artrix Limited in Auckland, New Zealand. I've been working in both the gaming and the financial services industry for more than 10 years now. And during those 10 years, I've shipped 7 different titles under different capacities, like level designer, game designer, but mainly as game economy designer. I've also obtained a bachelor's in finance, and I've worked in the financial services industry, doing both public and private equity valuations and financial consulting, covering different sectors such as manufacturing, services, and even IP valuation. So one of the questions that I usually get asked is, what is an investment banker doing working as a game designer? And that's like a fair question. Usually people like bankers and game designers are very different people. The people that are attracted to those industries are very different. And this is a very fair question, because when you think about it, bankers usually don't talk a lot about data. Bankers prefer wearing shoes. And bankers like to talk about boring charts and boring numbers, which is something that gamers don't do often at all. It's not our thing at all. So at first glance, the finance and the gaming industry seem to be very different than each other. But let's take a step back and look at what does a game economy designer do. So a game economy designer is in charge of designing the systems and the data structure for the game they're working on. They're also in charge of designing the virtual economy of the game, and that includes the different currencies, the different flows of those currencies, the commodities that are in that economy, and the pricing of those goods. They're also in charge by default of the monetization design. If the game is freemium or free to play, you have to monetize the features in it. And they're also in charge of monitoring the key performance indicators and running analytics on the game. So their role extends even after the game is released. You keep tracking the data and giving feedback on improving the game. So when you look at the different duties, you can see that game economy design is a balance between game design and finance. The similarities go beyond the theories. There's like challenges that are faced between, challenges that are similar that are faced between the people that work in those industries. Both industries run in an environment of uncertainty, and there's a lot of risk involved. And as a result of that, we spend a lot of our time putting effort into risk mitigation. Game designers try to make sure that the features are going to work without like making a massive risk. And to do that, they do a lot of prototyping, playtesting, and analyzing data. On top of that, both industries require a lot of effort. So you're always running against time, either because you're trying to match market opening times, market closing times, or you have deadlines that you have to meet by your publishers, licenses. So there's a lot of effort that might result in long working hours. Also, both industries require the people that work in them to have understanding of human psychology, to see what makes people tick, what makes people like feel happy, feel greedy, feel fear, excitement, fulfillment, all this sort of stuff. You have to have an understanding of that to be successful in those fields. So today I'll be talking about some economic principles and some analysis techniques that I've learned during my time in the financial industry that actually help shape my approach to game design and game economy design. The first principle I'd like to talk about today is the price elasticity of demand. Let's start with the definition. Price elasticity of demand is a measure of the relationship between a change in the quantity demanded of a particular good as a result of a change in price. This concept is very important when it comes to pricing both virtual and real-life products. So let's look at this formula. It's the total revenues of a product is basically the result of the price of that product multiplied with the quantity sold of that product. If we assume there is no correlation between price and quantity, we can safely say that if you increase the price or increase the quantity or increase both, then total revenues would go up. In reality, though, price and quantity demanded are usually negatively correlated. So if you increase the price, most probably the quantity demanded would drop. And basically, elasticity tries to answer the question of how much would that change will be. Let's explain this by an example. So suppose you're out shopping in the countdown and you want to buy some salt. So you head over to the salt aisle and you find out that the price of a pack of salt has dropped today from $2 to $1. So like any reasonable person's reaction to a reduction in price of salt, you go crazy and you start filling up your cart with salt. Like it's like a chance that you cannot miss, right? Or maybe you just don't do that. No one does that. No one's gonna like go crazy because the price of salt has dropped. It was even hard for me to find a picture of a cart filled with salt. This is sugar. So, so the natural reaction would be to get the amount of salt that you need, because you're not gonna put more salt on your food, at least, I hope. And you just walk away feeling really happy that you have saved some money today. And that will leave the salt makers with less revenues than they've originally started and feeling a little bit salty. So, so let's look at the same example again, but this time it's a different product. So again, you're out on the countdown. This time you're buying 6 packs of beers. So you head over to the beer aisle and you discover that the price of beer has been dropped from $6 to $4. So like any reasonable person, you end up buying 24. And that is the correct behavior. Because basically your demand for the beer is elastic. Because so as a result of that, a change in the price, a small change in the price, resulted in you demanding more of it. And this way you're making the brewers happy. Their reduction in price was actually effective for them. So in summary, if your demand on something is elastic, aka beer, a small change in price would result in a bigger change in quantity. While if your demand on something is inelastic, like salt, a small change in price would result in a smaller change in quantity. So the real question is, how do you use this in game economy design? There are several usages for it. So for example, when you're designing your virtual economy, one of the first things you should start to do is to identify your luxury goods, which are your beer, and your necessary goods in your economy, such as salt. And then you price them accordingly. And then you need to actually run some A/B tests, if possible, or run different scenarios to optimize the price of those goods. So for example, you price salt at like 5 hard currency in the game, and you think it's really good. Suppose salt in your game is not as a necessary good, and you want to sink more hard currency in the game. So by increasing the price of salt for a little bit, you'll be able to sink more hard currency in the game without negatively impacting the experience of the player. And this is basically way easier when you can A/B test different prices, because you can actually test how much the quantity demanded is changing. This is also useful when you're doing your sales strategy, because we know like beer, for example, your luxury good in the game, benefit a lot when you have a price reduction. So you know that the demand on one of the products in the game isn't as high as you wanted it. So you can run a specific sale on that luxury good. While if you run sale on your salt in the game, you wouldn't actually increase the revenues or impact your game's profitability in a good way. The concept of elasticity extends beyond premium games. It can be also used for like MMOs and RPGs and any game that basically has a complicated economy. I can even go further and say it's very useful when it comes to price your premium game. Just a heads up though, when it comes to pricing items such as like games and real economies, you're facing way more complicated factors than usual, because games by default are considered a luxury good. So when you're pricing virtual products, it's easier because you're the central bank, you're the market maker of that economy. So for the next topic, I'd like to discuss the ever-humble weighted average and the use of it in incorporating several factors to deduct the intrinsic value of goods in both finance and games. So the definition of the weighted average is basically it's a mean calculated by giving values in a data set more influence according to some attribute of the data. And it usually follows this formula. So basically the x's are the different attributes, and w's are the different weights that you assign to each attribute, and they determine the influence that the x's will have on your mean. This is used all over different principles in financial and economic theory. We use it to calculate the weighted average cost of capital for companies. We use it to calculate the returns on funds and portfolios. We even use it sometimes to do proper inventory costing. But most importantly, we use it to calculate the intrinsic value of a share or a company. And you can do that by running several valuation models on a certain stock. And then you give those different valuation models different weights, and you come up with a value that's a result of all those different models. You incorporated all the factors that are in those models in one value. You can even do that by running different scenarios, different forecasts, giving weights to those different forecasts, and then you come up with the mean value of what you believe is the most likely scenario. So how we can use that in game design? We can use it in doing matchmaking ratings. So suppose you have different factors to calculate your MMR rating, such as which country the players are in, how long have they been playing the game, which level they are, all that sort of stuff. You can give different weights for those factors to determine which has the highest impact in calculating your MMR. It is also used for pricing virtual goods and comparing the utility of those different goods to each other. I'll talk more about those 2 points in an example. So suppose we want to price a weapon and basically a sword in our game. Weapons have different elements to them in our game. They have stats such as speed, attack, whatever. They have different rarities, being common, uncommon, or rare. They have time you need to spend in the game to be made, and raw materials needed for making them. So basically, all of those 4 elements combined together, they give a value to the weapon. Let's look at it this way. So a weapon's score is determined by its attributes, its rarity, its time, the time needed to make it, and its materials, and each of them is given a specific weight. So in our game, suppose that the attributes is the factor that we care the most about, so we give it the highest weight, and materials is second most important. And rarity and time needed to be made are equally important, so we give them the same weight. We also think that rarity and time aren't as important as materials, so they're priced, they have like a lower weight. And this way we have like a weighted score for that weapon that basically mainly influenced by that weapon's attributes. So what do we do with that score? You can use it to price that item, because now you know this is the score of that item considering all the attributes that you put in it. Or you can actually have a sanity check on the previous price that you had for items. So suppose you priced the items in your game in a specific way, and you just want to check if your pricing was correct. You can also use it to compare it with other items. So again, like for example, I was working on a farming game called Country Friends, and I've already priced all the different items in that game. We had like about maybe 90 items, and I wanted to run another sanity check to see if I've priced the items correctly. So we had eggs, and we had an egg sandwich, and an egg sandwich basically needed eggs to be made. And when I ran the score for them, I noticed that the score for the egg sandwich was higher than the eggs, because by default, it needed the eggs to be made, so it needed more time, it added more value to it. But my pricing for it was actually the other way around, and because I run the double check using the weighted score, I was actually able to pick up that during my pricing model, I did not incorporate the hierarchy of the items in my model. Also, just a heads up, because in the majority of the times you're using the weighted average, you are the person who's setting up the different weights. So you're actually saying, this is what I believe is important, this is what I don't believe is important, and you're assigning the weights according to that. So it's very important to double check your assumptions, either by, if you have a live game and you have like forums of players like talking about what do they perceive as value, what is the most important thing in the game, you can take that, or if you track data and you see if you actually, what you've priced the items is correct. Another concept that we have in finance is called price targeting and stop loss orders. So I use these more as a methodology to approach design more than a literal application. I'll start with the definition. A price target is the projected price level of a financial security stated by an investment analyst. This is the price at which the trade or investment wants to exit the existing position so they can realize the most reward. It's easier to explain an example. So suppose you are interested in buying a stock that is currently worth $10, and you want to check how high that stock can go. So you go and you run your analysis, you build your forecast models, and then you estimate that the stock is going to hit 20 New Zealand dollars. That is your target price. That's where you aim to exit your investment. So once the stock hits $20, you're going to sell it and capitalize on your gains. While stop loss order is an order that's placed by a broker to sell a security when it reaches a certain price. So again, with the same example, if you bought that $10 share, you're waiting for it to get to $20, you can't just hold on to it no matter what happens. So you run your estimates, and then you say, okay, if it drops to $5, I'm going to sell it immediately. This is the minimum, like the maximum amount of loss that I'm willing to accept. And this way you've set the highest amount of gains you can get and the lowest amount of loss you can achieve. So what's the point of that? It basically minimizes the damage you can get from being emotionally attached to an investment. So you don't get caught up in the market cycles. So when the stock drops like to $4, you don't say, it's going to come up for sure, I should buy more of it or whatever. You've already made your assumptions, you commit to them. Unless you now have different knowledge of what's happening, you don't need to change that strategy that you had. It is also good for double checking your estimates, because you have now a set target, you know exactly how it's going to be achieved, and you understand why the stock is heading in that direction. So you avoided being caught by hype, you avoided being just following the market trend and all that sort of stuff. And this is very important for you because it also lets you sleep at night. You don't have to worry about your investment strategy anymore. You've already set it up and you know where you're going. So how is that applied to game design? It's more like an effective thinking methodology. So you should set targets for what you want of your current feature. So you want to add a feature to the game. You want to know why that feature is being added. Is it targeting retention? Is it targeting engagement? Is it target monetization? And then you check the KPIs to see if that feature has met that target. I'm not saying that you should, some features add value to other features indirectly. Not each feature has a specific target, but in general, features should have a main reason why do they exist. And it's also can help us when we're doing early prototypes, so we don't get distracted of what we need to have in that prototype, and we don't waste production time that way. So suppose we want to prototype a game. It's like a third-person shooter, but instead of winning by killing the other player, you win by coloring the territory they're in. Sounds familiar. So do we need sound effects for that prototype? No, we don't. Do we need character design for that prototype? No. Actually, that's all what we need. We just need to test the core mechanic, and this is actually Splatoon's first prototype, and this is what actually moved the game from being just a prototype to being released. So you set the target of what you want from your prototype, and you don't get sidetracked by small fluff that you don't really need to achieve it. So for our next concept, it's called vertical analysis. And basically, vertical analysis of the income statement is a method of financial statement analysis in which each entry is represented as a proportion of sales. So it's basically a methodology of analysis that focuses on looking at elements as a proportion of other elements instead of looking at them in absolutes. How is utilized in finance? You basically break down companies' main revenues and cost drivers, and you understand actually how they're running. It also highlights the area that you focus on while building your forecasts. It helps you compare companies of different sizes to each other, and it helps you analyze key factors that affect a certain industry. So let's take an example. This is an income statement from Air New Zealand. By the way, all the numbers are made up. It's just a simplified income statement. So let's assume this is a fictional company called Air New Zealand. And here you can see the different revenues that the company has. They're making $3 million from their passengers, $150,000 from their cargo, whatever. And you can see their expenses. Their highest expense is like $1.5 million from fuel. And you can see their net income. It's not so useful looking at absolute numbers. We can just see that their net income is positive, but doesn't really mean much. If we add percentages to it, if we check the percentages of everything to total revenues, now by a quick glance, we can actually see that their key sales driver is the passenger. We don't care so much about building the forecast for their cargo unless they have expansion plans when it comes to cargo. We know now that 36% of their expenses compared to their sales is in fuel. So because we have those percentages now, we know exactly also what's going to affect the company. So if the fuel prices change in the world, New Zealand will be affected. If their employees go on strike and they need to increase their salaries, we know they have kind of the capacity to increase their salaries a little bit because it's only 19% of their sales. And we can tell that they need to spend more on their passenger services because it's barely a percentage of their sales. It's also important if we want to compare this company with another company. So we run the same, regardless of their scale, you can actually easily compare them to each other by having those percentages. So how do we utilize this in game design? So suppose you get assigned to a new project and it's in a genre that you've never worked on before, and you really want to understand what this genre is, what do the players play these games for, and where do those players spend their money. So the easiest way to do that would be to go check the top grossing games, the top competitors, and you try to understand them. Suppose you're making a Monster Collection RPG game on mobile, and you notice that one of the top grossing games is Summoner's War. So you go and you pick up that game, you play it for a while, and now you have an understanding of that game. So you come up with a key feature list of that game. Again, this is simplified. The game has way more features than that. But suppose these are the features that you come up with and you notice are the key main features in that game. Now you can go ahead and assign estimates of what you think the players spend time in each of those features. So you can tell the game is very PvP driven because the players spend 40% of their time in that feature. And you can kind of tell that the single campaign is important because they spend the second highest amount of time in it. You can also do the same exercise by money spent in that game. And this way you can see that the gacha is their highest monetizer. So by having those percentages, you can actually also see not only the core features that are the heart of the game, but you can also see how the monetization is working. So because combat PvP is very popular, players are spending a lot of time in it, it's actually what's driving the gacha. The players are spending 50% of their money in the gacha because they want to obtain those new monsters from there, they want to level them up, and they want to beat their friends in PvP. Just be careful because it also shows here, for example, that daily login rewards only gives you 0% of monetization and 5% of time spent, but that doesn't mean that the feature is entirely useless. It's just the main target of it is retention, so it's not expected for you to monetize on it. But it also shows you that it's not in the core of the game. So if you want to start working on the project now, and after you've done this exercise for several other competitors, you can pick up exactly what are the key factors and key features that you have to design in your game. So you're not going to start on the daily login. Most probably you shouldn't start immediately on the fusion and the gacha. You should start with the combat, the core of the game, build the gacha and the fusion on top of it, and then eventually add in the modular features such as daily login rewards. So it's important for you in also assigning different priorities for your production time. It wouldn't make sense to put 50% of your company's resources or production time on daily login rewards, which is a feature that only the players spend 5% of the time on it and barely spend any money. So before I wrap things up, I'd like to mention the last couple of words as a heads up. I think we should be always aware of falling into analysis paralysis because production time is not infinite. So analysis paralysis is basically when you get data, you want to make a decision, you gather some data, and then you realize that, okay, maybe I want more data to make this better decision. And you keep just doing that more and more and more and more, and eventually never make a decision. And I think you should be wary of that because production time is very important in games, and projects usually take longer than they expected. So do your homework, do your analysis, but make a decision and commit to it. Also, data can be very deceiving. Bias is definitely a thing, and the scariest biases are yours. So a lot of times you would want a scenario to be true. And if you dive into the data thinking like, I know I'm right, I just need the numbers to confirm that I'm right, most probably they'll confirm it. It's very easy to convince yourself with looking at a specific set of data just to confirm with yourself that what you're saying is correct. You should dive into the data thinking, I want to find something that proves that I'm not totally correct. I want to find the data that contradicts me. And if you don't find that, then I guess you made the right assumptions. You've actually benefited from analyzing the data. And for the last thing, I'd like to say that fun is rarely made in spreadsheets. It's a very tough job just to try to make a fun game using only spreadsheets. So it's very important that you find the fun in your game and see why people are attracted to your game. And to do that, sometimes you have to look up from your spreadsheet and look at the game itself. So thank you everyone for coming. I hope that was really useful. And I think we have about 10 minutes for questions. Yeah.
Going back a bit to when you're talking about setting the ratings.
Yeah.
Features. Are there any kind of mindsets or tools you can say that make those estimates fairly accurately?
Well, usually what I rely on is checking different games and benchmarking them and reverse engineering them if that's possible. So again, because I'm still working on an RPG Monster Collection game, I studied that genre, and then I tried to reverse engineer the different formulas that the other games are using and see if they actually have different weightings for those items. The second thing is, and this might sound, it's basically relying on your gut a little bit, because if you're the designer on the game, you kind of know exactly what you want the player to experience. So even if the other games, like in your benchmark, they're focusing on, suppose in our example, they're focusing on attributes, but your game, you want the player to actually focus on maximizing their time, then you should put higher weight to time. It's basically what you want to achieve from your game plays a big role in that. And the third thing is, if you work on a game that has data and you're tracking data, it's very useful for that. You just double check if what you perceived as right value is correct by the players as well. And you have to update that according to the data that you get. Is there anyone else? Oh, well, yeah.
Just as a follow-up, I think specifically the chat about how much or where players are spending the money, like is that you making educated guesses as well?
Well, it depends sometimes. Like if you're working in a company that has released several titles, like when I was back at Gameloft, we had like a big roster of games that we can actually compare the data for. That was easier. Other than that, you can also check different industry benchmarks and analysis that are out there. If you don't have access to any public data or private data, you're going to have to dive into the games yourself, go into the forums. Like there's a lot of games that I played that I thought, this is the key factor of this game. This is what the players are going after. But you go into the forums and then everyone's talking about something totally different than what you thought. So checking the forums, talking to the community itself, and playing the games yourself would be also useful to do that. Yeah.
Have you seen any games that use in-game currency inflationary pressure to get people to spend rather than just hoarding their money or
Well, not that I can think of from the top of my head. Usually I feel economy designers try to counter inflation by putting massive soft currency sinks than actually trying to monetize on inflation. At least from like my experience in the freemium industry, usually designers struggle with the inflation of soft currency because you give that to the players for free. And as a result of that, for high-level players that have a lot of hard currency and they buy whatever they need, we just create massive soft currency sinks to counter that inflation. If you want to monetize on inflation, then you can consider basically you'd have to counter hard currency inflation, which will be a bit tricky because unless you're actually changing your pricing according to different eras in the game, you don't have the same IP store for all different players. It might be a bit tricky to have your hard currency inflate. You can fake inflation by increasing different prices of the products as the player level up in the game.
Would it be possible to reduce the cost of certain goods purchased and flooding the market with the good brothers, so the currency stays the same. But you're like, okay, if I wait for too long, everyone's gonna have one of these. So I'll either get it now and benefit from it, or if I wait till later, everyone's gonna have a sword level 10. I might as well spend now.
Well, it depends if it's going to give you a competitive edge now. Like usually if you want to do that, like if you want to flood the market with a thing, you might want to do that for a time limited like event, and that will like increase your monetization more. But as if the example, as you said, that thing is going to be available for everyone and everyone's going to have it, then by default its value is going to drop. So it may not be attractive to players. Oh yeah.
I think one example I could give Ivan's question is in role-playing games, often I find myself gathering a huge number of consumables but never actually using them because I'm saving them for when I really need them.
Yeah.
And eventually, like in Diablo, there's health potions of varying sizes, and the later into the game, the tiny little health potions, they restore a negligible amount of your health.
Yeah.
And you can buy so many of them that your whole inventory is full. They have no use, so you're better off buying them when you actually need them.
Yeah, and I think also this is usually a problem in either games that have different sets of difficulties. So if you're playing, for example, you're playing like Persona on medium difficulty, you're going to most probably end up with hoarding those items that you don't need them. While if you play on a harder difficulty, which is usually what the designers intended the difficulty for the game to be, you won't be able to hoard those items so much. And I think also part of the reason that we end up hoarding those items and not use them in games because if the game is mainstream, usually the difficulty for it has to be accommodating for low-level players as well. And this is why maybe hardcore fans of that genre end up just hoarding up way more items than they think they don't actually need them.